Are we ready? Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Bible study. We are continuing our study on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Paul said that to know Christ is the greatest, that everything else is lost compared to knowing Christ. To know Christ, we need to know what he taught, what he believed, what he lived. We are currently in a series looking at the parables. Parables contain a lot of the basic teachings of Christ. A parable has been defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, and that's a pretty good definition. Basically, a parable is an illustration of a truth. All good teachers basically do three things when they teach. They explain the teaching, they illustrate the teaching, and they apply the teaching. Well, Jesus was the greatest of teachers, a master teacher. And so he was very good at illustrating what he taught. An illustration, a parable, it paints a mental image, a mental picture of what you're trying to teach. And Jesus used the common things of the day. He talked about weddings, and he talked about growing things and herding sheep and all kinds of things that were common to the people so they could understand what he was teaching. And so last week we began looking at some of the parables. Today we have come to Matthew 13, the parable of the tares. Interestingly, this parable has been one of the most controversial and most problematic of all the parables that Jesus taught. First, let's look at the text and we'll talk about it. To lay the background first. In the Middle East and wherever they grow wheat, there is a weed that can sometimes appear in the wheat. It's called a tare. It's actually called darnel. The bad thing about it is that in its early stages, the darnel plant looks just like the wheat plant. You can't tell them apart at all until the grain actually comes to fruition, until just before it's ready to harvest. You cannot tell just by looking at the plants which is the weed and which is the healthy plant, which is the good one. Now, the darnel is kind of poisonous, so you do not want to harvest it because it is somewhat poisonous. It can cause people to be sick. It can cause hallucinations and so forth. So it was a problem in the Middle East. Now, in this particular case that Jesus is going to talk about, he's going to talk about that this was a deliberately done action, that an enemy planted the darnel in the wheat. And so we'll pick up Jesus' story. Now, he compares this to the kingdom of heaven, so keep that in mind. Remember, Jesus was talking about, most of what he talked about, more than any other subject, Jesus talked about the coming kingdom. Matter of fact, the first thing he said was, the kingdom is near. Everything is about the kingdom. Salvation is in the kingdom. Jesus' goal in coming to the earth was to reestablish the kingdom of God. And so now he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, the owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time I will tell the harvesters, collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Is going to have people in it who are not authentic Christians. The kingdom reaches out to everyone. When we preach the gospel, when we teach the truth, some people are going to be drawn in who are not going to accept every bit of the truth. There are going to be people who are drawn in for various reasons, and they may not actually be real, authentic Christians. There are hypocrites in the church. That's just a fact of life. And so Jesus, first of all, is recognizing this truth, that the kingdom is going to have within it people who are not very religious, there's going to be some bad folks in the church. There are going to be some folks who aren't totally dedicated to Christ. That's just a fact of life. But he's telling us it's not our job to go through the church directory and pick out the folks that we don't think are authentic Christians and get rid of them. That's not our job. This parable tells us there is a day coming when judgment will occur. And he says God will take care of sorting out the non-authentic from the authentic. We don't have to worry about that. That's not our job. Unfortunately, there are people who are not what we would call real Christians, but that's up to God to make that determination. We don't have to worry about judging people and telling them, well, you're not a real Christian. Unfortunately, in the church, there have been folks who disagreed about things. Yeah, we're human. We're going to have disagreements. There have been issues with women's dress, and there's been issue with what version of the Bible you use, and there's been all kinds of issues in the church over the centuries. And Jesus based a way that he's obviously bringing shame and disgrace on the church, that the church can take action to temporarily withdraw fellowship from this person. But the purpose of that is to bring him back, to impress upon his mind that he's not in step with God. But again, this is not about us separating out the church, to judge the members of the church. The image of the wheat here is that when the good grain grows up with the weeds, that their roots get entangled. Well, if you pull out the weeds, sometimes you rip out the good grain too. And so he says, you don't have to try to purify the church. We don't need to have pogroms where we go around and rip people out. That's not our job, and that's not helpful for the kingdom. God will take care of that at the proper time. He then talks about the mustard seed. The mustard seed is a very tiny seed, and he's going to use this to illustrate another great truth about the kingdom. Again, the people of that day were familiar with seeds and planting, so he just uses a common seed that people would be familiar with. The mustard seed was one of the smaller of the seeds. It wasn't the smallest seed known to the Jews, but it was a very common seed, and they would understand the concept of the tininess of the mustard seed. And so he tells them this particular story. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Start small. In a town, there may not be the known world. Today, the kingdom is on every continent and on every nation on earth. There are millions of people who have been taught the truth and have come into the kingdom. And so the idea is the kingdom starts small, but it is very powerful, and it will expand, it will grow, and it will become something powerful. And that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. He then turns to the parable of the leaven. Now, as a kid, I didn't know what this parable meant because I didn't know what leaven was. Leaven is a bacterial form. It's something you add to dough, and in several hours it will begin to spread, and it will grow, it will produce a gas, and it will cause the dough to expand. And the whole point of his parable is that when you add just a little bit of leaven to a huge bowl of the dough, in a short time it will spread throughout the dough. It will affect the entire amount. And so Jesus is using this. It starts small, but it will spread throughout the entire area. And the church, when it's done properly, will affect the area in which it's in. That's one of the responsibilities of this church, is to be an effect in the entire neighborhood in which we have been found. We also send out missionaries all over the world, all over the country. And so we're spreading wherever we go. The church is not to sit idle. The church is not to be in isolation. We are not to hide within our walls, but we are to be an influence over all the world, over all people. And so he's saying that's the power of the kingdom of God. This next parable is one that is crucial to us in a practical way, and that is the parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl of great price. This is a well-known parable, but it's one sometimes I don't think we understand the true meaning of the text. The illustration comes from a common practice in the days of Christ. In those days, they didn't have banks, and people had no safe place to keep their valuables. And so it was very common for people to bury their money or jewels or whatever they had of value in the ground, put it in a box and bury it. Because there was a lot of banditry. Israel was on several roads that foreign armies to other people. The Roman Empire was especially greedy for pearls. Many of the emperors had pearls and would give them to their wives and so forth. So we have Jesus using these two illustrations. And remember, he's using the buried treasure and the pearl. Again, this is one of those parables that can be taken out of context. Now, the parable says that a man found the buried treasure and then he recovered it and he went back and bought the land and so on. And some people are saying, well, that seems dishonest. You know, if you found treasure on a man's land, shouldn't he tell the man? But that's not the point of the parable. The point of the parable is not to talk about the honesty or dishonesty of the action. The point of the parable is to show the man's dedication to the action. Notice what Jesus said. The kingdom of heaven, the church, the kingdom, what Jesus has come to set up, is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Jesus is trying to make one point, one powerful point that, like I said, is important to us today. And that is, the kingdom of heaven is of inestimable value. If the man found the valuables buried in the ground, he went and bought the whole field so he could get that one thing. He sold all he had so he could get it. And the pearl is so valuable that the man sold everything to get this one pearl because of its great value. And so Jesus is telling us that the kingdom of heaven is so important, so valuable, that even if it costs everything we have, our friendships, our job, our very life, it's worth it, whatever it costs. Most of us won't have to sacrifice a lot for it, but he says if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Whatever it costs, the kingdom of heaven is that valuable. It's total dedication to one thing. And Jesus is trying to get across to the people. The kingdom of heaven is of highest value. Nothing else comes close. And so whatever it costs you to get it, whether it's your love, your treasure, your time, your life, whatever it is, it's worth it. Because that's how valuable the kingdom of heaven is to us. And so it's a great teaching. Now Jesus turns to the laborers in the vineyard. In chapter 20, I'll read the text. I didn't have time to put it all on the PowerPoint, but again, this is a very common event in the days of Christ. This is a fairly well-known one of the parables. For the kingdom of heaven. Evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workmen and pay them their wages, beginning with the first hired and beginning with the last hired and going to the first." The workmen who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when these came who had hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked for only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the heat of the day." the burden of the work. But he answered one of them, Friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Now again, this is one of those parables that is not to be taken out of context. Now the situation is simple. In those days, there were hired slaves, there were hired servants who worked for someone permanently. But much of the work in Palestine, particularly in the fields, was seasonal. And at certain times of the year, a landowner would need a lot more work, such as at harvest or into the square. And there would be men on various streets. If you needed a plumber, you go to a certain street, and there would be 10 or 15 plumbers sitting on the sidewalk. And you drive down the road, and you'd say, hey, you guys plumbers, and they'd have their tools with them. And you would hire him for the day or whatever you needed. And so that's what was happening here. And so this landowner needed some workers in the vineyard. Vineyards were very common in Israel at this time. There's a lot of rocks and they can't grow a lot, but the grapes grew well in that soil. And so he went first thing in the morning and he hired men, and they agreed to work for a denarius. So he took them. Well, he realized he needed more help, so he came back all through the day, and several times he hired additional work. This was very common. But at the end of the day, when he began to pay them off, and he paid each of them the same amount. And then naturally the guy who had worked 12 hours was a little ticked off at the guy who only worked 1 hour, making the same amount. This is human nature. We all would feel the same way, I suspect. But the owner says, wait a minute, you agreed to work for that. I'm not being unfair. You agreed to work for a denarius. You worked for a denarius. I paid you a denarius. No harm done. But something about our nature, if I do more work, I want more money. Now, what's this got to do with the kingdom? What in the world has this got to do with what Jesus is trying to teach? Again, he starts off by saying, ultimate, it's the greatest, it's beyond everything else. And so it's kind of foolish to talk about, well, some people deserve more than others. That's not the issue. And so Jesus is making this point. Coming into the kingdom is what matters. Whether you come in as a youngster, whether you come in as an oldster, it's irrelevant. The important thing is, are you in the kingdom? God is the one who decides the reward. God is the one who... Salvation is a gift of God anyway. You cannot earn it, so it's kind of foolish to even argue this. Well, I've been a Christian for 70 years. I deserve more than the guy who's only been a Christian for a year. No, you can't earn salvation. It is a gift of God. And if God chooses to give it to someone who's only been a Christian a short time, that's God's decision. That's not up to us. So this particular parable probably talks as much about our human weakness, our human way of looking at things, as anything else. Then we have the parable of the two sons. Starting in verse 28 of chapter 21. What do you think? There was a man who had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, Son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, I will, sir. But he did not go to the land, the sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the average guy in the street. And Jesus is trying to make a point here by saying, look, you guys feel like you're so righteous. You guys feel like you do everything right. But in the final analysis, you're not doing it. You're like that son that said, yes, I'll do it, but then you didn't do it. He says, now the prostitutes and tax collectors, they realized they were sinners. They realized they were wrong. They repented. They came to doing what's right. And they will be in the kingdom. They will be the ones who will be accepted. It's not the man who says, yes, I'm going to, and then doesn't do it. It's the man who says, yes, I will do it. I realize I've been wrong. And so this parable teaches us very simply. Are we willing to do what's right? Are we willing to repent? Are we willing to realize that we were wrong and come to the truth? It's not about our self-righteousness. It's not about thinking highly of ourselves. It's about, are we willing to follow what Jesus says? That's the one that will be in the kingdom. Well, thank you for joining us in our study today. We will pick up that there at our next date. Thank you for being here.